All right, our historical record will go back to Nimrod from this Normus palette right here. But it's chronicled wrong by Great Britain. But we first to give you the best source I can give you. Now, this Minis victory tablet of King Narmer from Heracleopolis, beginning of the early dynastic period in Egyptian National Museum. Heracleopolis is not part of the pre-dynastic period, though. That's why I think the stela was dated into the wrong date. Heracleopolis is in the 9th dynasty and at the 10th dynasty of Egypt, Heracleopolis. It's not mentioned in the previous proto-dynastic period. That stela was not part of Abydos. It was part of Heracleopolis in the 8th and 9th dynasties. So that stela has been chronicled as an event. That preceded it. This was a boundary stone or a stone marked for Nimrod conquering all of that land of the old empire of Adam and Enoch and Top the Atlantean, all of those things. He acquired this land in a latter period, okay? So when it says Nimrod conquered the world, became the king of the whole earth, at 40 years old, there was a war between his brethren and the children of Japheth, so that they were in power of their enemies. He found a large valley opposite to the east. He built a large, extensive city called Shinar. That's in the book of Jasper, chapter 7. Now, I want to read about Nimrod's dream. Nimrod had this dream, and it's going to have prophecy and a prophetic meaning to me, and it's going to give you the beginning of our history from the land of Egypt and Cush, out of Ethiopia or of Samaria, of Akkad, of the Akkadian Empire. Okay, here we go. Book of Jasper, chapter 12. It says, and when the king heard the words of Abram, he ordered him to put into prison, and Abram was 10 days in prison. And at the end of those days, the king ordered that all the kings, princes, and governors of different provinces and the sages should come before him, and they sat before him. And Abram was still in the house of confinement. And the king said to the princes and sages, have you heard about Abram, the son of Terah, has done to his father? Thus he done to him, and I ordered him to be brought before me, and thus he has spoken. This his heart did not misgive him, neither did he stir in my presence, and behold, now he is confined in prison. And therefore decide what judgment is due to this man who reviled the king, who spoke and did all the things that you heard. And they all answered the king, saying, the man who reviled this king should be hanged upon a tree. But having done all the things that he said, and having despised our gods, he must therefore be burned to death. Well, this is the law in this matter. If it pleases the king to do this, let him order his servants to kindle a fire both day and night in thy brick furnace, and then we will cast this man into it. The king did so, and he commanded his servants that they should prepare fire for 3 days and 3 nights in the king's furnace that is in Casdim. And the king ordered them to take Abram from prison and bring him out to be buried. And all the king's servants, princes, lords, governors, and judges, and all the inhabitants of the land, about 900,000 men, stood opposite the furnace to see Abram. And all the women and all of the little ones crowded upon the roofs and towers to see what was doing with Abram. And they all stood together at a distance, and there was not a man left that did not come on that day to behold the scene. And when Abram was come, the conjurers of the king and the sages saw Abram, and they cried out to the king, saying, our sovereign Lord, surely this is the man whom we know to have been the child at whose birth the great star swallowed the 4 stars. We declared to the king now 50 years since, and behold, now his father also has also transgressed thy commandments and mocked thee by bringing thee another child, which thou didst kill. And when the king heard their words, he was exceedingly wroth, and he ordered Terah to be brought before him. The king said, Hast thou heard that what the conjurers have spoken? Now tell me truly how didst thou, and if thou shalt speak the truth, thou shalt be acquitted. And seeing that the king's anger was so much kindled, Terah said to the king, My lord, and the king, Thou hast heard the truth, and what the sages have spoken is right. And the king said, How couldst thou do this thing, to transgress my orders and to give me a child that thou didst not beget, and to take value for him? And Terah answered the king, Because my tender feelings were excited for my son at the time, and I took a son of my handmaid, and I brought him to the king. And the king said, Who advised thee to do this? Tell me, do not hide aught from me, and when thou shalt not die. And Terah was greatly terrified in the king's presence. And he said to the king, It was Haran, my eldest son, who advised me to do this. And Haran was in those days that Abram was born 32 years old. 32 years old when Abram was born. But Haran did not advise his father to do anything. For Terah said this to the king in order to deliver his soul from the king. For he feared greatly. And the king said to Terah, Haran thy son who advised thee to this shall die through fire with Abram. For the sentence of death is upon him for having rebelled against the king's desire in doing this thing. And Haran at that time felt inclined to follow the ways of Abram, but he kept it within himself. And Haran said in his heart, Behold, now the king has seized Abram on account of these things which Abram did. And it shall come to pass that if Abram prevail over the king, I will follow him. But if the king prevail, I will go after the king. And when Terah had spoken this to the king concerning Haran his son, the king ordered Haran to be seized with Abram. And they brought them both, Abram and Haran his brother, to cast them into the fire. And all the inhabitants of the land and the king's servants and the princes and all the women and little ones were there standing that day over them. And the king's servant took Abram his brother, and they stripped them of all their clothes, excepting their lower garments which were upon them. And they bound their hands and feet with linen cords. And the servants of the king lifted them up and cast them both into the furnace. The Lord loved Abram, and he had compassion over him. And the Lord came down and delivered Abram from the fire, and he was not burned. But all the cords with which they bound him were burned, while Abram remained and walked about in the fire. And Haran died when they had cast him into the fire, and he was burned to ashes. For his heart was not perfect with the Lord. And those men who cast him into the fire, the flame of the fire spread over them, and they were burned. And 12 men of them died. And Abram walked in the midst of the fire 3 days and 3 nights. And all the servants of the king saw him walking in the fire, and they came and told the king, Behold, we have seen Abram walking about in the midst of the fire, and even the lower garments which are upon him are not burned, but the cord with which he was bound is burned. And when the king heard their words, his heart fainted, and he would not believe them. So he sent other faithful princes to see this matter, and they went and saw it and told it to the king. And the king rose to go and see it. And he saw Abram walking to and fro in the midst of the fire. And he saw Haran's body burned. And the king wondered greatly. And the king ordered Abram to be taken out of the fire. And his servants approached to take him out, and they could not. For the fire was round about, and the flame ascending toward them from the furnace. And the king's servants fled from it. And the king rebuked them, saying, Make haste and bring Abram out of the fire, that you shall not die. And the servants of the king again approached to bring Abram out, and the flames came upon them and burned their faces, so that 8 of them had died. And when the king saw that his servant could not approach the fire, lest they should be burned, the king called Abram, O servant of the God who is in heaven, go forth from amidst the fire and come hither before me. And Abram hearkened to the voice of the king. And he went forth from the fire and came and stood before the king. And when Abram came out, the king and all his servants saw Abram coming before the king, with his lower garments upon him, for they were not burned, but the cords with which he was bound was burned. And the king said to Abram, how is it that thou was not burned in the fire? And Abram said to the king, the God of heaven and earth, in whom I trust, and who has all in his power, he delivered me from the fire into which thou didst cast me. And Haran, the brother of Abram, was burned to ashes. And they sought for his body, and they found it consumed. And Haran was 82 years old when he died in the fire of Casdim. And the king, princes, and inhabitants of the land, seeing that Abram was delivered from the fire, they came and bowed down to Abram. And Abram said to them, do not bow to me, but bow down to the God of the world who made you, and serve him and go in his ways, for it is he who delivered me from out of this fire, and it is he who created the souls and spirits of all men, and formed man in his mother's womb, and brought him forth into the world, and it is he who delivered those who trust in him from all pain. And this thing seemed very wonderful in the eyes of the king and princes, that Abram was saved from the fire, and that Haran was burned, his brother was burned. And the king gave Abram many presents, and gave him his 2 head servants from the king's house. The name of one was Oni, and the name of the other was Eliezer. And all the king's princes and servants gave Abram many gifts of silver and gold and pearl, and the king and his princes sent him away, and he went in peace. Abram went forth from the king in peace, and many of the king's servants followed him, and about 300 men joined him. Abram returned on that day and went to his father's house, and he and the men that followed him. And Abram served the Lord his God all the days of his life, and he walked in his ways and followed his law. And from that day forward, Abram inclined the hearts of the sons of men to serve the Lord. And at that time, Nahor and Abram took unto themselves wives. The daughters of their brother Haran, the wife of Nahor, was Milcah, and the name of Abram's wife was Sarah. And Sarah, wife of Abram, was barren. She had no offspring in those days. And at the expiration of 2 years from Abram's going out of the fire, that is, in the 52nd year of his life, behold, King Nimrod sat in Babel upon the throne. And the king fell asleep and dreamed that he was standing with his troops and host in the valley opposite the king's furnace. And he lifted up his eyes and saw a man in the likeness of Abram coming forth from the furnace, and that he came and stood before the king with his drawn sword, and then sprang to the king with his sword. When the king fled from the man, for he was afraid, and while he was running, the man threw an egg upon the king's head, and the egg became a great river. And the king dreamed that all the troops sank in that river and died. And the king took flight with 3 men who were before him, and he escaped. And the king looked at these men, and they were clothed in princely dresses as the garments of kings, and had the appearance and majesty of kings. And while they were running, the river again turned to an egg before the king. And there came forth from the egg a young bird, which came before the king, and flew at his head, and plucked out the king's eye. And the king was grieved at the sight, and he awoke out of his sleep, and his spirit was agitated, and he felt a great terror. And in the morning the king rose from his couch in fear, and he ordered all the wise men and magicians to come before him when the king related his dream to them. And a wise servant of the king, whose name was Anuki, answered the king, saying, this is nothing else but the evil of Abram and his seed, which will spring up against my lord and the king in the latter days. And behold, the day will come when Abram and his seed and the children of his household will make war with my king, and they will smite all the king's host and his troops. So we're going to start right there.